Hello there, friends. Andrea with the Bangs here, and get ready for another fantastic guest. I'm always so happy to have anyone on, but really, I feel, I guess I could just say blessed to have such excellent scholars, I'll say. At least this next guest, I would definitely put him in the category of scholar. His name is Richard Rohlin, and he is a medievalist, but technically I believe it's German philologist. And yes, I will ask him what exactly that is, so don't worry, you'll find out. But he is the co-host of the Amansul podcast, hosted by Ancient Faith Radio. If you're familiar with the Lord of Spirits podcast, also on Ancient Faith Radio, he co-hosts with Father Andrew Stephen Damick. I listen to it, and it's an excellent podcast if you are interested in delving into Tolkien's more meaty writing, the Silmarillion and beyond, I guess I'll say. He has also written a chapter in a book called Amid Weeping There Is Joy, Orthodox Perspectives on Tolkien's Fantastic Realm. So he has written a chapter amongst other Tolkien Orthodox scholars. I forgot to ask him what he wanted to plug in the episode, so I'm just really trying to get in the plugs that I should have gotten in during the episode, right in the intro, so go check those things out. Let's get to what we're doing in this episode today. I know Paul Vanderklay has been talking quite a bit about the discarded image and the way that our model is changing, and I think this particular conversation with Richard fits in quite well after the one that he had with Jonathan last week. So I hope you enjoy. Please let me know what you think about the model that we discuss, the medieval model as compared to our model currently. Any questions that you might have for Richard, and maybe give me a like and subscribe if you're new. So thank you so much for listening to this long intro. And without further ado, here is Richard. If we're going to talk Tolkien, I need to be on task in the sense of getting organized enough to be able to not just be fangirling out on all the things.
I mean, fanning is fine. At the end of the day, it's all just, all of the scholarship is just an elaborate excuse to talk about things I like. So
I know, because we're all so cool. All of us Tolkien friends, we're the coolest folks.
Yeah. Well, I was telling Pajot a couple of days ago, I was you gotta understand, the Tolkien stuff, that's what I talk about to seem respectable. The stuff I'm really into, all these weird medieval legends and stuff, that stuff, it's hard for people to sort of to track with that sometimes. So
well, I want to hear about the medieval legends, but not right now, because
yeah
so it is in the order of the day, because we will be talking about the discarded image, which is about the medieval model, we'll say, because that's what not Tolkien, oh my goodness, Andrea, please get it together. C.S. Lewis, switching gears, different inkling. So we'll be talking about C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, and is it right to say you're a medievalist? Is that an actual word, or did I make that up?
Yes, that's a real thing. I usually tell people
Richard Rohlin, everyone. I didn't even introduce your name. Richard Rohlin, everyone. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yes, that's actually right. Most people get it wrong the first time. And you're Andrea with the bangs, to differentiate you from some other Andrea.
I know, but the thing is, I put my bangs back today.
I know.
And
I was a little disappointed. I was oh, well, now he's
the thing is,
Andrea with the full head. I don't know.
I slept with them weird. They were... the headbands just worked today. So, Richard, medievalist.
Yes, medievalist. I always tell people I'm a medievalist. It's easier to explain than Germanic philologist.
And philology is...
Philology is the, let's say, the study of the way that languages change, and the texts that are written in them. So
Oh,
you might have somebody who's a linguist and they mainly just study a language, right? And then you might have somebody who's maybe more on the literary side of things and they're studying like something like Beowulf, but they're doing it mainly in translation with a little help from linguists. But the tools that are put together that both of those people use are put together by philologists. So
okay.
that's kind of what I do. And I did my grad work on some Old Norse poetry, and I'm kind of like specifically an Old Norseist in that sense. But then also, you can't study the Middle Ages without, you know, let's say it's more difficult because everything is so interconnected. It's just difficult to be siloed, and it's not, you don't really want to be siloed either. I'm not the kind of person who's just interested in, I'm gonna just go down this one little rabbit hole. There's so many rabbit holes. Why wouldn't you go down them all? Essentially,
Right.
that's my approach. So yeah, I'm a medievalist. And I have obviously I'm a Christian. I was previously, some years ago, I was an evangelical pastor, and now I'm Eastern Orthodox.
Hmm.
So a lot of that actually has to do with my medievalism, and there's that kind of a feedback loop there. So yeah, that's kind of my deal, and I'm excited to talk about C.S. Lewis with you today.
Yes, I am as well because like I said, I just in the like I said, not on today's episode, on last week's episode, I mentioned this to Jonathan and Paul, how I just finished reading it, and it worked out so well because the very last sentence has the word pattern in it, and I was all exclaiming to Jonathan my revelation of, I get it, patterns, symbolism.
I
Anyway,
saw that somebody on the Symbolic World made a little a callback to one of the very first internet memes ever, which is the
I
Badger
needed a
Badger
little
Badger.
help in understanding
Yeah,
exactly because I had no concept of
when we
what
were
this
little
was.
kids, that was hilarious. Just so you know,
I
when we were
wasn't
little kids,
aware. So,
it's just super.
yes, if anyone's interested, go to the Symbolic World. I was the one who posted that, so just look up my name and you'll
Yeah,
find the meme
yep,
of that
yep.
someone made. And I think Jonathan retweeted that on Twitter. I think he said something like, "I think part of my soul was stolen here." Anyway, anywho, so we're getting
Okay.
real niche.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So where do you want to begin this
Right.
discussion
Okay.
of the discarded
So
image?
the discarded image. I have to say, I I've done a bit of a Tolkien. Oh my gosh, C.S. Lewis, Andrea, get it
It's
together.
gonna
I'm so
happen. It's
sorry.
gonna happen over and over
I
again.
can't believe. Do you do this? I can't believe I did
No.
it a second time. It's right here in the title. C.S. Lewis. They're rolling in their
Yes, Lewis.
graves
We're
right
talking
now.
about the other Inkling. There were actually like a bunch of people in the Inklings group, but everyone remembers just these two guys.
I
So
know Barfield, but only because people in
that's
my
good.
Discord group love him. So and Paul
Yeah,
Van Clee loves him. So I haven't read
yeah.
any of him, but I do know of him.
Barfield's super important. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, C.S. Lewis. So I've been reading a number of books by C.S. Lewis lately, not on purpose. That just ends up being the books that we do in our book club over on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. Before this one, I think we just did The Magician's Nephew for funsies. And then before that, we did Till We Have Faces, and I know you just finished doing that one with your own book club. And so I was,
Yes.
in a C.S. Lewis space, and then someone suggested we do this one, and it was like, okay, let's just continue on the Lewis train. And then this is so much harder than anything I've ever read of his. Now, mind you, I haven't read all of
It's
C.S.
totally
Lewis.
different. Like, because you're thinking, oh, it's C.S. Lewis. There's probably gonna be like talking animals and stuff, and then there's none of that. So
Yeah.
it's yeah,
It's
yeah.
just he starts in the deep end, and this is a series of lectures that he put into a book. So he talks about the model. He doesn't really even explain what he means by model. You just kind of pick it up. So can you give a bit of an introduction or summary or both to the book?
Yeah. Yeah, so the book is basically it's aimed at helping a younger generation of scholars. And this book it's a book aimed at scholars. So just to like a little bit of my personal history about this book, which might be a good way of introducing it, is that it's essentially the book that converted me to not Christianity, because I was already a Christian, but it converted me essentially to the medieval way of thinking. I hate the word worldview, so I'm going to try not to use it.
Okay.
Um, but let's say the medieval social imaginary, which is a term I like a lot better than worldview. So a
Okay.
long time, I mean, this was many years before Jonathan Pajot started making videos or anything else like that. I was already getting plugged into that kind of stuff and that way of thinking. And basically, this was the book that kind of converted me. And in fact, after I read this book, I just said, I'm going to read every text that he mentions in this book. And so that began a multi-year process of just immersing myself in medieval literature, which is actually how I ended up deciding to do a graduate degree in medieval studies. It was basically because I was already studying all this stuff, and I figured, well, I may as well study it with some people who know what they're talking about. So that's kind of how I got to doing that. So basically, what he's doing is he's proposing a model, and we have a model that we use to think about the world right now. And the problem is, of course, that it's falling apart, right? That's basically the whole reason you have this channel, and a lot of other people have channels where they have these wonderful, fascinating discussions on YouTube and elsewhere. It's because the model that we've all used up till this point is falling apart, and we are in need of something to replace it with. And so the question is, what's going to step in and fill that void?
You are fast-forwarding to my last question, Richard.
I'm sorry. Well, I just want to sort of like explain. So what that old model is, we'll talk about what might replace it later.
Yes.
What that old model
I have it written down, the question. So.
Yeah. So what that old model is a not the medieval model, but the model that was kind of current at Lewis's time, is a way of basically something that starts with the Enlightenment, starts with the whole idea, even in Christian circles, of natural law. And that is basically that there are these laws which govern the universe. They make the universe knowable and understandable. And if you violate these laws, then things start to go sideways for you in one way or the other.
Okay.
Now, this can apply to something like the law of gravity, right? But it can also apply to like the idea of moral law. So when people make a case, for instance, in a case for like Roman Catholic social ethics, theology of the body, and that sort of thing, all of that thinking is based on the idea of natural law. So there are these laws that should govern sexual behavior, and there are these laws that should govern the way that parents raise their children and things like this. And that if you violate those laws, then the consequence of violating those laws is going to be it's going to be pain, it's going to be sorrow, it's going to be these various things are going to result. And those are sort of just like natural consequences or natural you could almost say like punishment for breaking the rule, right?
Right.
So that was the model of Lewis's time. And what Lewis talks about in this book is how silly this sort of is. Not silly in that it's not useful. Obviously, it's been useful for a whole lot of things. But the idea that there's, like a law of gravity implies like there's a municipal physics court where if, somebody will write you a ticket if you violate the law of gravity or something like that. It's a metaphor, and it's kind of a funny metaphor if you think about it for very long. So the medieval model is different from this, and he lays this out in primarily four works or four authors. Okay. Chalcidius, Macrobius, Pseudo-Dionysius, or Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, depending on what you want to call him, and then Boethius. So these are the four authors of what he calls the seminal period. And basically, these four authors together, the intellectual and mystical life built around the writings of these four authors really shapes the thinking of the Middle Ages, and it shapes the way that the people.
Was the time period? Sorry, of these four authors, they were. Mm-hmm. It was the early medieval or even ancient.
Let's say within the first 500 to 600 years AD.
Okay.
Yeah. As far as for instance, the Dionysian corpus, most scholars would say now it was written around the 500s,
Okay.
but there are some people who would take a more conservative view that's actually much older than that. But in any case, it's certainly a tradition that, let's say, solidifies around the 500s, something like that.
Okay.
So, and so basically, the works of these authors create a way of thinking about and interacting with a world that thinks of a world that's not held together by laws, but a world that is held together by love. Right?
Right.
Why do rocks fall down when you drop them? Because they're trying to get back to earth, right? Everything's sort of drawn. Chaucer's phrase for this is kindly inclining. In other words, moving towards the thing that is your kind, right? Everything's trying to get sort of back to its origin point. And so Boethius then says, and Chaucer following him, that because the soul comes from God, the soul is made to make the ascent to God, right? So this idea that everything's sort of trying to get back to its origin point. So it's a way of thinking about the world as being held together, drawn together not by law, but by love. And this makes it possible for somebody, for instance, like Dante, who is sort of let's say, the end point of the great medieval synthesis. Post Dante, things start to fall apart. It's not really Dante's fault. It's just like he's a convenient dividing line, let's say.
Okay.
And so that makes it possible for Dante, when Dante is talking about sin in Purgatorio, he actually gives us two different views on sin in the Divine Comedy. There's the view on sin that we get in Inferno, and then in Purgatorio, the view of sin that we get is that there are sins which are caused by a lack of love. There are sins there are sins which are caused by an excess of love. In other words, loving good things to like more than they deserve. Right. So this goes back to the idea that this is in Aristotle. St. Augustine talks about this, the idea of the ordo amoris, the ordering of the affections, the ordering of the loves. So the idea would be that you can love. Food is a good example, right? It's not wrong to love food, right? God gave us food. Food is good. It's not wrong to love food, but if you love food too much, then it becomes the sin of gluttony, right? And gluttony has its own sort of natural consequences, but from the medieval perspective, you wouldn't say, oh, don't eat too much or you'll become obese and get diabetes. They would say, I mean, that might happen, probably will.
Yeah.
But what they would say is, don't eat too much because you will deaden your soul to God, right? So that the more important
that's
thing,
quite
the more
the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, Saint Seraphim of Sarab. Now, this is going east a little bit, which I'm going to try not to do so much until the end. And in a little bit, I'd like to talk about the things that C.S. Lewis gets wrong about the Middle Ages, because I think that would be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious.
We'll come back to that. But Saint Seraphim of Sarab, who's a Russian ascetic and mystic, he says it is impossible to comprehend the mysteries of God on a full stomach, right? Which is could seem like an extreme thing to say to a lot of people.
Well, he is an ascetic. So
he is an ascetic, yeah. But also, I mean, there's when we talk about comprehending the mysteries in the Orthodox Church, we mean eating. So it's like the mystery, right? Is communion. It's the Eucharist,
of course,
and so
right.
So we go fasting to the mystery, which is a nice phrase from Lewis, actually. So anyway, all that to say, they would say don't eat too much, not because you might get diabetes, but they'll say don't eat too much because if you start turning your heart towards earthly pleasures, and that the love for those earthly pleasures becomes disordered, then you will cease to, your soul will stop, like you'll deaden your soul. And what your soul wants to do is ascend to God, right? So you'll deaden your soul, you stop listening to it. And instead you'll let your body kind of drive the bus, which is the problem. And that's really the root of Christian asceticism, is not a hatred of the body. It's it's more like it's a love for the body, that we want the body. St. Ephraim the Syrian says that in the age to come, the body will become what the soul now is.
Okay.
The soul will become what the spirit now is, and the spirit will participate in the life of God. So you can sort of like see the whole goal of like the Christian ascetic tradition is to move your entire being up the ontological ladder, like by a rung.
Okay.
So I'm mentioning that because asceticism, like that's a super important part of the Middle Ages, and it's very little understood today, I think.
Well, because it could come across as a sort of Gnostic. I think it was the sort of, was it the Martianism or Doceticism that was the flesh?
Docetism,
right. So yeah, that the flesh was bad, and that sort of dualistic perspective. So I'm glad that you clarified that, because
say, I mean, in the we're in the Orthodox Church, we're just wrapping up Lent right now.
Is today Good Friday for you?
No. So today's the last day of Lent, and then the fasting gets fastier. So next week is Holy Week, and it's not counted as part of the 40 days of Lent, but we still fast. In fact, we fast a little more intensely.
You get fastier. Okay.
You get fastier, yeah. During Holy Week, and of course the point of Holy Week is to ritually participate in the journey of Christ to the cross, and then down into hell, and then his glorious resurrection. So, all that to say, in the beginning of Lent, one of the things that we actually say in our services is we fast so that we might gain a body.
Wow.
So you could sort of think like a body that's just being driven around by all of its desires, like inordinate desires, loving food too much, loving sex too much, etc. That's not even really a human body. Like at that point, it's just kind of an animal body.
Right, because that's what animals will do if they can.
That's what animals, Like, I mean, I raise animals for food, and some of those guys will just, if you put food in front of them, they'll keep eating.
Well,
right?
especially the goats.
Especially the goats, or, certain kinds of chickens that we raise for meat and things like that. So we fast so that we could gain a body. In other words, so that our bodies can really become human bodies. And in this way, sort of anticipating the resurrection. So anyway, just maybe a little clarity there.
No. So I know this is a practice in the Orthodox Church, but it also sounds like you were saying there were many ascetics in the medieval period. Would you say the medieval period goes from 500 to 1500? That's what I remember learning in like elementary school.
Sure. That's good.
Okay. So that is quite a popular thing. Then and so is this it similar to the Orthodox perspective then that those practices?
What you'll find is that particular ascetic practices, as far as like, do you eat fish during Lent or not, or something like that? Those things depend on like your climate and where you live and things like this. But the character of Christianity, all the way up to the Protestant Reformation, and still in much Western Christianity until about 50 years ago, has always been deeply ascetical. Even in our country today, there's a reason that McDonald's still serves the fish fillet on Fridays. Right.
I didn't. Wait, what? That's.
Yeah. So in the United States, I don't know how it is in other places, but the McDonald's where I live, has a fish option on Fridays because they don't want to lose Catholic business. So. Oh,
do Catholics not eat like beef on Fridays?
Yeah, Catholics are. I don't think this is actually even this used to be like sort of like a rule, and now I think that might have changed. But I'm not a Roman Catholic. I don't want to unfairly characterize anything. But they wouldn't eat meat on Fridays. So on Fridays you would have fish. Right?
Oh, okay.
But that's because in most Western countries, fish was considered a fasting food, a Lenten food.
Okay.
Whereas like in the Mediterranean, it's not necessarily.
Oh,
or it's kind of like on the border. But it just has to do with where you live and what your climate is. Like for
right,
instance, if you live in Northern Europe during, late winter, early spring, if you don't eat fish, you just don't eat, in the
right.
Middle Ages. So like obviously, you know, that's not an option for someone like that there. So what I'm trying to say is the individual rules might have varied, and they're actually not so important.
Well, the
Right.
spirit of the law, right, rather than
Right.
the letter
Right.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the spirit of the thing is more that you have to fast. Right.
Okay.
You know. No. And then but the way that works itself out practically. I mean, that might depend on where you live or what your health is or things like that. But some level of asceticism, even for just like normal lay people, the experience of somebody living in a village in England in the 14th century, that was just a normal part of their life.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, because that's something that is talked about, that maybe not everyone was so concerned about the model, but they all participated in it, even if they wouldn't be
Right. Yeah.
pondering it necessarily.
Right.
They would just be
Yeah.
existing in it, and everything had its place. And could you go? And it was very
Yeah.
widely accepted by
Yes.
the culture, like more than any model maybe since then. So
Yes.
can you go on a little bit about that?
So you have this idea of everything's held together by love, right? And then based off of this and based off of the theology and the philosophy of these four figures I mentioned a moment ago, they started to work out the way that for instance, the universe is laid out around us, right? And a very popular misconception about the medieval model is that it was anthropocentric in that it basically puts man in the middle, like man is the center of the universe.
Right, I remember
But it's
reading
actually
that.
it's
Yeah.
more like it's more complicated than that because there are at least two levels. One is that it's more like Earth is the bottom of the universe. Basically, if God is out here, right, and then you have the spheres going in, at the very center, that's Earth, which means that every direction you go from Earth is heaven. Okay? So
Right.
if every direction you go from Earth is a globe, which, contrary to popular belief, everyone knew the Earth was round
They
in the
called
Middle
them the
Ages.
spheres.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So they knew the Earth was round, and they sometimes got some funny ideas based off of that, but they knew perfectly well the Earth was round, and so so any direction you go from Earth is up, right? And so this is why Dante puts hell at the center of the Earth. I mean, he's not the only person to do this, but the reason, so like at the very middle of hell, which is also the Earth's core, is Lucifer, is Satan, right? Well, the reason Satan is there is because that is the farthest you could fall from God.
Okay, below
Right.
the Earth, really, yes.
Yeah. So at the center of the planet Earth in the Ptolemaic model would be as far from heaven as you could get, right? That's why the devil is there,
Okay.
right? That's as far as he could get kicked out, essentially.
Okay.
So, so this affects the way that they of course view, the way the heavens and the spheres work, the movements of the stars, and then also, the things in the earth, animals, the idea of soul, right? That soul is something that everything has.
Oh yeah,
Rocks
vegetable,
Right.
vegetable,
Rocks have mineral soul.
and
Plants have
animal,
vegetable
and
soul.
yeah.
Animals have animal soul.
Yeah.
And then man has a rational soul, right?
Mm.
And so part of this idea is that everything that's up the next rung ontologically also recapitulates, like contains all of the stuff below it on the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
So like humans have animal soul and vegetable soul, and mineral soul, because we have all of those things in us, but we also have a rational soul that we
Right.
sort of share with the angelic beings, and that animals don't have, right? So yeah, it's and there's a way of looking at the human body, a way of understanding history. I don't know how much you want to
Right.
go into.
I remember the history one quite. Yeah, like the way that one just really stuck out, because the idea of, oh, you don't need to worry about whether it happened. They thought of it as happening, but not in the way that we think of it as happening. but it's however the teller tells the tale. That's what matters.
Right. Yeah, we think of, and I think this is one of the things Jonathan Pageau has worked the hardest on, trying to get people out of this frame of thinking. Because we tend to think, when we think of history or something, like, we're always go back to, but did it really happen? And what we mean by did it really happen is, if we took a video camera,
Yeah.
and we videoed those events, would it match perfectly this written account? But the funny thing is that even if we took a video and you watched the video and I watched the video, we would still end up watching two completely different videos, because there would be things that I would notice, and there would be an interpretation which I would derive from that, and then you would have things that you would notice.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in the Middle Ages, they're sort of less concerned about the idea of authorship. Basically, there are no journalists at this point, right? And of course, now journalism is actually kind of like flipping back to this, right? If you pay attention to what's going on, journalism has once again become more about perception than it has been about, let's say, just communicating some objective facts.
Yeah,
to the point. And I'm not trying to make a political point here at all, but if there's these videos that go out there of that police shooting or this stabbing or whatever, right? And there's some stuff like that going around right now, and you can have half of the internet, like the entire internet, everyone on the internet watching the same video, and half of the people come away with, oh, this person was in the wrong, and the other half of the people come away with a completely different perspective. And whichever side of that you're on, it sounds like the other people are just totally crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Because there is no literal meaning, right? Because people bring their own interpretation and their own lens to the table. And so in the Middle Ages, they understood this. And what's unique about the Middle Ages is that everyone has a more unified frame.
Yes.
Because of Christianity, because of a common Greco-Roman philosophical inheritance, everyone has a more unified frame. And so there's some things that Lewis says. For instance, he says the Middle Ages depended predominantly on books. Though literacy was, of course, far rarer than now, reading was in one way a more important ingredient of the total culture. Now, he's right about this. I think he's also a little wrong about this in a couple of ways maybe we can get back to later. But when he says this, what he's saying is that for somebody to have written something down in the Middle Ages it's a big deal. Paper is expensive most of the time, especially in Western Europe. Things are being written on animal skins, parchment, vellum, etc. And that means that not only do, to prepare that page, you have to go kill a calf that could have grown up into a cow. Right. And could have provided milk or could have provided meat or a lot of other things that many people would think more important than paper.
Okay.
Right. And so there's an economic cost and also like lost economic opportunity when you choose to make writing stuff. So if somebody writes something down, good chance is it's pretty important. And that doesn't mean that there isn't some frivolous stuff, especially like in the margins of more important stuff. But for the most part, if somebody wrote something down in the Middle Ages, it was because they felt like it contained or preserved some wisdom that needed to be passed down that couldn't risk being lost. Right. And so, and actually, most of the things we have written down in the Middle Ages that are actually preserved, which is only about 5% of what was written. Oh. So we've lost probably 95% of the things that were written down in the Middle Ages.
Why is that?
Just the accidents of time. I mean, the climate of Northern and Western Europe is really rough on things made out of leather, things made out of skin. Okay. And it's not like the, like the Iraqi desert where we can dig up a clay tablet from 4,000 years ago because it's clay, it's dry, it's hot, like nothing's going to happen to that tablet, Right. Western and Northern Europe, much more difficult climate. And then also a lot of times all these texts would be collected into large libraries, which would then have just very poor fire safety. Okay. We've lost, you'll get a kick out of this. The Beowulf manuscript, it's the only manuscript we have of the poem, was nearly completely lost because it was in a fire in this library called and I kid you not, called the Ashburnham House. Now, if I was going to put my library, I know, if I was going to put my library in a building, I would not put it in a building named the
Like it's
Ashburnham House.
basically a warning sign.
Yeah, like, it's a real symbolism happens moment. What can I say? Like, it's, yeah. So, and actually, the only reason we have the Beowulf manuscript is because someone sort of chunked it out a window. So there are some fire damaged pages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And actually, some of the fire damage is sort of very wonderfully right in the part of the poem where the dragon comes in, which is again.
Oh, that's another symbolism happens
Yeah,
situation.
yeah,
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting things going on there. So anyway, but in the surviving stuff that we have, a lot of the stuff we have are things like charters, like land grants, law codes, things like this, because it was important for people to feel like they lived in an ordered world, and a
Right.
world where things had their place, and you could know what your place was. And even if your place was, I'm a serf or I'm a peasant, you know your place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can sort of figure out where do you fit into the world. And then what all of that allows you to do, especially the religion of the time, is it allows you to position yourself in a place in the world that allows you to seek out not the like the American dream, right? But instead, seeking virtue, seeking contentment. It's not to say it was a perfect period. It had all the same sinners that our own period has, but they also had a better way of maybe dealing with some of the issues that that are coming back now, and we're having to figure out how to deal with them.
Right. Yeah. So it's one of the things I do. Okay. So after this question, I want to hear what you think that is incorrect about what C.S. Lewis said, and then we'll end with what now? What with regards to the model? But okay. So I do like that they have this in this. It was speaking about symbolism, and so they had their center was rather large in the sense that everything was ordered in the center. But he does go over the fairies, which is I can't remember what he called them. What did he call them?
He calls them the longevi or the longivi,
I had
which
no
means
idea how to pronounce that.
The long livers. Well, actually, I don't either, because my Latin is all classical Latin, and he probably means it to be said like longevi or something like that.
Okay, yeah. But that's really the margins, and that's where things could go awry and be a little bit unpredictable. But I love that they had a space for the margins, because even the margin needs its place.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I think this is going to be on Sunday's Amon Sul episode, so you can tune in.
Oh, right, you do the podcast Amon Sul as well.
Yeah,
I didn't even introduce you properly at all.
It's okay.
Yeah, everyone.
It's okay.
Thanks for sticking with us and listening. So go check that out.
At the end, maybe you can just let me pitch a couple of projects for people.
Sure.
Yeah, but so the Amon Sul. In Sunday's Amon Sul episode, so this will come out in 2 days, so you guys can tune into that. Father Andrew and I actually talk about this. We talk about the way that Christianity is actually able to integrate even the stuff from paganism into its frame, right? So in the Middle Ages, for instance, you have Dante, who's able to freely move between Christianity and Greco-Roman paganism in the Divine Comedy without any issue.
Right.
And it would not have given his readers a moment's pause. Right. This is just the way that they thought about the world, because Christianity, and here I mean like medieval Christianity, which had its own peculiar quality, which is in many ways very different from what a lot of people now encounter as Christianity. But medieval Christianity it had space for these things. It's sort of like, especially once Christianity hit this point in maybe the 6th century or so, where it had really thoroughly triumphed over paganism, right? That there were still a few pagans out there, but they were more or less, they weren't running anything anymore. They certainly weren't persecuting anybody anymore. When Christianity hit that point, it was able to relax and just sort of say, but but even before that point, Christianity never stopped, for instance, using classical Greek poetry, like the Homeric epics, as part of its educational system. So one of the things, for instance, that Julian the Apostate does, who's a late 4th century emperor, he's the last pagan emperor of Rome, right? And he's called the Apostate because he was baptized as a Christian and his parents were Christians, but then he left the faith. And so when he becomes emperor, he tries to make one last ditch attempt to return the empire to paganism. And one of the ways that he tries to do this is he makes it illegal for Christians in certain cities to use Homer to educate their children, right? And he does that because Homer's how you get an education, right? If there's no Homer, then you're not educated.
Okay.
So if these guys don't have education, then they're not going to be fit to take government positions, and that's how we're going to get Christians out of the government, right?
Oh, I'm
So
like, what's the end goal with that? Okay.
Yeah. So the fact that he did that is really good evidence, actually, that even in the early church, they were just, of course, there are a lot of church fathers who talk about this, so it's not just one piece of evidence. There's a lot of evidence that even in the early church, as they're locked in like a life and death struggle against paganism, they're still using Homer to teach their kids. I mean, what else are you going to use?
Right.
So that's the kind of the capacity. One could even say it's sort of the Catholicity, right? As in like the wholeness of the medieval model, that it's got a place for these things. It's even got people have asked me more than once, like, do you really believe in fairies? Of course the answer is yes. Obviously fairies exist.
Like Santa exists?
Like Santa exists. And so a way to think about fairies and elves and things like that is as sort of like a dispossessed or a dethroned principality, right? Well, once
right,
these
they
things
weren't happy little Tinkerbells.
No,
and even
not
Tinkerbell
all.
wasn't really happy. But anyway, yeah.
But their solution was not to say, well, we're Christians now, so we don't believe in any of this stuff, right? They found a way to integrate it into the model, and that's sort of like the great genius of medieval Christianity, in my opinion. And of course, as Lewis points out, there's always what he calls a Christian rite, which preserves these things. The way that Chesterton puts it in his poem, The Battle of the White Horse, is that it's only Christian men who guard even pagan things.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's a Christian rite that is interested in preserving the stuff, but there were people. A very famous example of this is Charlemagne's Minister of Education, an English monk by the name of Deacon Alcuin, who deeply disapproved of all of these monks back in England who were like, he didn't target Beowulf specifically, but it was, they were copying and even singing in the monastery like these Beowulf-like stories. He's very salty about that. So there are definitely there was a conversation that was had about this. There was a push-pull, but basically the consensus of the tradition over time was to preserve the things that are good about paganism. To make room for fairies, to make rooms for the monsters on the edge.
Right.
Because if you try to, obviously if you try to banish them completely, they show up again.
For you. Yeah.
Unexpected ways. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That's what we're doing right now. Man, we keep on coming to like the last question because it's so pertinent, but I do want to hear first what you think Lewis got incorrect.
Yeah. So what I would say is, when I say here's the things Lewis got wrong about the Middle Ages, I mean that's kind of like, it's a little bit of a clickbait kind of a title, because people's ears perk up and they're like, wait, Lewis got some things wrong, whatever. But
we'll get to it 40 minutes in, everyone.
I know. That's how you just tease that at the beginning and then you wait for them to come in before you answer that question. But to say, what did Lewis get wrong? Well, this book is it's a book by an academic. It's aimed at other academics, and because of that, it's super text focused. And I think that if we were going to write a sequel to The Discarded Image, that what we would want to do is to look not just at what were people reading, but what were people doing. And
Right.
so we could say this manifests itself in a couple of ways, because I think everyone who's been following the symbolism conversation for a long time knows that many people hit this point where they're like, okay, I can't just talk and think about these things anymore. Like, how do I actually embody this? How do I manifest this in my life? So the as you said a moment ago, most people in the Middle Ages weren't thinking about the model; they were just living in it. It's just the
Mhm.
air that they breathe. So if we were going to write a sequel, one of the things that we could do is say, well, let's look at the perspective of like a 14th century medieval peasant. What was their daily experience? How did they interact with this model? And the way that for most people did that was the parish church.
Okay.
And so in the Middle Ages, so we can talk about England in let's say the 14th century, so like 100 years before the Reformation, right? The expectation was everyone went to church at least once a day. Like, unless you had a really good reason, you'd be at least one service a day. On
Right.
feast days, and before the Reformation, so the Reformation removed about 50 days from the Christian calendar.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons, and these would be days where people were not really supposed to do manual labor.
Okay.
So one of the reasons that the Industrial Revolution follows the Reformation is because 50
Oh, they're
working
allowed
days
to
get added
work.
to the year.
Oh.
Yeah, 50 working days get added to the year.
Okay.
Now, it's a whole conversation about, is that, obviously that's a great way to become wealthy and expand, but
The
is that
Protestant
better for the
ethic and the
human?
spirit of capitalism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wasn't going to mention it, but yeah, that's
Yeah, you did, Andrea. Okay.
there's there's definitely an argument to be made for that book. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Mhm.
so the Reformation does remove, and I'm really not trying to pick on anyone here, but the
Mhm.
Reformation really does remove 50 days from the Christian year. And so for the experience of like a peasant in the Middle Ages would be going to church daily. And on feast days, you're going to church like 3 times. You're going to Vespers the night before, you're going to Matins the morning of, and you're going to Mass that day, which is fine because you have off of work, and afterwards you have a big party. And that's
Who
that's
doesn't have
the
a
focus.
party?
You know, that's the focus of your John Calvin. That's who. No, I'm kidding. Um, but that's the
No
focus
fun.
that yeah, that becomes the focus of your social life, right? But it's also the way that, for instance, charity worked.
Mm.
That there are no government programs to take care of the poor and the destitute in your community, but there's a social expectation and a religious expectation that on these great feast days, of which there are many throughout the year, right? On these great feast days, one of the things that the wealthy people in your town or your village are going to do is they're going to spread out a huge banquet on their front porch. And all of the poor people in town get to come eat. They get given money. And that's how like if you were in the underclass, that was how you lived.
Nice.
Um, yeah. So it's and again, you have to ask the question, what's better for the human soul? For the government to tax me and to give my money to someone else? Not saying there aren't maybe good times for that to happen, right? But is that better, or is it better for me to invite my neighbor onto my front porch,
Right.
right? Which one of those things is really fulfilling the command of the Gospels?
Right.
So there's a great book on this, which I want to sort of bring to the attention of people in the symbolic world community. I didn't write it. I get no money for promoting it. This book is called Eamon Duffy. It's written by a really great scholar, historian named Eamon Duffy. And the book is called The Stripping of the Altars. I'll put it up right here. And if you want to know what did the ritual life and the experience of daily prayer and the interaction with the scriptures and all that stuff, if you wanted to look at what does that actually look like for somebody living in the Middle Ages on the eve of the Reformation, this is a really great book.
Okay.
The other thing to sort of say that Lewis misses, that I think this is the biggest lacuna in his work, and I think this is you can't really understand
Wait. We need a little. By we, I mean me. What does lacuna mean?
It just means like the biggest lack. It's the same word,
Oh, okay.
right? The biggest
I'm not
absence.
afraid to appear
I admire
uneducated
that.
and ask questions. Just to be clear.
No,
By
I
that.
admire that.
So
That's really great.
okay, I'm
So
glad to know that now. Okay.
yeah, so the thing that Lewis is really missing is the deep idea that exists in the Middle Ages of the communion of the saints. So again,
Okay.
I'm getting a little religious here, but I can't help it. It's completely inevitable when you're talking about the Middle Ages. The people in the Middle Ages did not think of themselves as, heaven wasn't empty, right? If you read Dante's view of paradise, it's hierarchical, but it's also just full of people, right? And all of those people have a unique relationship to God, and they have a unique relationship to each other and to the people still living on Earth. So, right, there's this. So when people went to pray, they didn't have the sense of just, you know, it's just me and Jesus, and there's nothing else out there in the cosmos, right? But they thought of themselves as actually kind of participating in this larger communion. And Lewis, I don't think I think this is something he never fully gets. He gets close to it a couple of times in his Space trilogy, for instance, but
Well, he talks about the
he was
ether, that was full of
yeah yeah
between us and the
yeah
moon. That there's
yes
things,
spirits
spirits
the
and
all the like
daemons or
intermediary
demons.
the intermediary hierarchies and things like this. What he doesn't get though is the participation of humanity in those hierarchies,
Okay.
right? And so you've been listening to Lord of Spirits podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the big things they talk about in there is this idea that when St. Paul talks about humans becoming sons of God, that what he's talking about them is actually taking place. They're humans taking our place in these celestial hierarchies, right?
Mm.
So Lewis made the distinction there's a collection of his essays called God in the Dock. And in that book of essays, in one of the essays, he makes a distinction between what he calls the thick and the clear religions, right? And so he says, by thick, he means religions that have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments, the God of this place or of that place or something like that. And then, he says Africa is full of thick religions. And by clear, he means those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church, which is like a particular movement in Christianity in Lewis's time. He says these are clear religions. He says if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly. Right. So Lewis knows this, and actually, Until We Have Faces, which my reading group just finished last night, which is beautiful. He actually comes the closest, I think, in any of his works to really coming to grips with this in his fiction. Medieval Christianity is full of both thick and clear things, and which is why you have to sort of experience it to understand it fully. So this is why you get somebody like who most people would think of as like a very clear person, like a big theological titan like St. Ambrose or St. Augustine, right? Who could compose hymns to jubilantly celebrate the miraculous finding of a martyr's relics, right? Which is something that I suspect that most modern theologians would be too sober to do, right? That, it's difficult to imagine Calvin, for all of his love of Augustine, he hates relics because he feels like they're superstitious, right? That's a rejection of this thick part of Christianity.
Okay. Yes.
And this is why, it was precisely the people who lived the clearest kind of existence, right? The hermits, the stylites, the monks, like the ascetics and the pure theologians. But in the iconoclast in the Byzantine Empire, these are the people who are defending the thick uses of incense and the liturgical arts and the veneration of icons. So it's a world that had rejected both the extremes of paganism and you could say Platonism, not because either one of them was too much of something, but because both of those extremes, you could say like the mystery cults and Gnosticism, are not enough of anything, right? This is because you need this integration. And so in the nave of even the smallest medieval church, the altar, which is where they're offering the Mass daily, right, in and out through the brightest and darkest nights of the year, the altar was the focal point of the whole building, and the elevation of the host would become the focal point of the Mass, right? But at the same time, even though there's the focal point, so there's a center, even the name of even the smallest medieval parish church is also, it's full of beads and icons and candles and whispered prayers and people showing up in the middle of mass to say the rosary and then leave, right? And so there's like this whole world of personal and paraliturgical devotion that's all oriented towards the altar, but it's organic and it's growing. It's kind of like the undergrowth of a great forest, right? And very much in a way that many of the reformers and definitely the people of the Enlightenment found very unsanitary and very chaotic.
Okay, so those are the thick parts of the medieval Christian worship, then, I guess. Is that correct to say Christian worship, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just like the experience, your experience daily going to the church, right? You get up in the morning, the bells for matins are ringing, you go to the parish church, you hear the psalms, you say your prayer. Okay.
So there's some parts.
Go out.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
And you go out to do your work in the day, and in the middle of the day, maybe depending on where you live, maybe the Angelus rings at noon, so you stop and you say a few prayers, then you go back to your work.
Right.
And it was just like breathing.
Right. Yeah, you participated, the participatory aspect and the very real, I guess, spiritual hierarchies that you participated in.
Yeah.
Okay, because he does mention about how they didn't actually think that angels were had giant wings that flew around in the sky. They understood that. That's, they weren't, like, we like to think, oh, we're so, like, above them. That's, I think, what people just love, to be above the previous, but they knew whatever it was, but they understood symbolism. They understood that it wasn't real, but it was real. It was like they understood what real means with regards to angels with these big giant wings. Like the devil has big wings in the center of the earth that are flapping and making it cold. Right. So that's the thing, is it seems like they got it. They wouldn't have trouble watching Jonathan Pageau's videos. Right. I mean, other than being like, what is this magic? They'd be like, why is he they'd be like, why is he wasting so much time telling us things that we know? Like, let's get on with the important stuff here. Yeah, like how does this work? How am I seeing this magic box produce pictures? Right. Yes. Yeah, but it's, it seems like they understood more than we understand of the symbolic, because that's how they lived.
Yeah. And a word that I've been using a lot lately that I sort of like, and I've stole it from physics, is the idea of polyvalence, right? So like overlapping orbits. Okay. So you can say in the Middle Ages they grasped a symbolic way of understanding things that was just intuitively polyvalent. They understood that there were places where meaning and even narratives could overlap, right? And so nowadays, for instance, we'll say, oh, here's two people that have similar-ish legends, and their names kind of sound the same. So they must have been, like, originally one character, and then they were split into two. And so we look at this and we say, oh, well, or we'll say maybe these two characters actually got confused, because people were dumb and they didn't know that this Helen over here and this Helen over here are actually two different Helens. And so what we're going to do is just discount one of them and say this other one's the real one. Mm-hmm. And that would have been a very dissatisfying way of thinking about the world to somebody in the Middle Ages, because what they would have seen instead is that sense of overlapping meaning between those two Helens, or between these two. Like, that's not to put it in software terms, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Like, of course that's the way things are. How else would you expect the world to work? Right. And so this idea of overlapping meaning, and I just want to say, like, in the late Middle Ages, to talk a little bit, just a little bit more about the experience of church. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I think there's a perfect, you could call it an icon of the medieval model, and it's something that if you look at it, you'll just intuit the medieval model, and you won't need to read this whole book by C.S. Lewis on it.
Oh, well, now you tell me. Okay.
Yeah. So, in in late medieval Western Europe, right, this structure developed called the rood screen. Have you ever seen a rood screen or heard of one? Rood. Rood. Rood
No,
means cross. Rood means cross, like
no, I
the
haven't.
crucifixion. Okay, so you can go out and maybe look at some pictures of one. But basically, what a rood screen would be is it started out as just like a bar across. So like you have the sanctuary and then the nave. The sanctuary is where the altar is, and then the nave is where the people are, right? So you have the sanctuary and the nave, and so the rood was originally it was a bar that would go across the ceiling at this division point between the nave and the sanctuary, and they would put a crucifix on top of that, so that you could constantly throughout the service have your eyes fixed on the crucified Christ.
Hmm.
And then what eventually happened is these screens became really beautiful and really elaborate, and usually the bottom half of the screen would be opaque, and what they would do is they would put on it icons of various saints, and then
Hmm.
the top half would be kind of this beautiful lattice work that you could look through and see what was happening on the altar.
Hmm.
Um, and so this idea of the root screen then was to basically present an icon, present a picture of the cosmos to you, right? With Christ crucified at the top, right? At the very top of the mountain of paradise. If you go look at Jonathan's first image of everything that he did, right? You've got the crucified Christ as the tree of life at the top of the mountain, right?
Hmm.
Um, so Duffy says that these screens were first and foremost Christological images proclaiming the centrality of Christ's death. But then they would have these, but then on the right side would be the Virgin, and on the left side would be usually John the Evangelist in the Western rood screens, because those are the two people who are at the foot of the cross at the
Okay.
crucifixion.
Okay.
But then the lower level would be all these different pictures of saints, and it might be your patron saint. Like if you donated some money to the church to help build a rood screen, they put your patron saint on there, right? And otherwise it would be like the apostles, the angels, things like that. There's a lot of variation about this. But the idea was the saints stood in this literal sense under the cross, right?
Mm.
And their presence on the screen spoke of their dependence on and their mediation of the benefits of Christ's passion. And so we see here their role as intercessors. We see them, but also the idea is, here's the altar. The altar is paradise. The altar is heaven, right? And then you're here in the nave. You're still on earth. But what's the thing that connects you? Before your own death, what's the thing that connects you to paradise? It's the communion of the saints, right? It's the sacred narrative that you're participating in.
Mm.
So what you can do, and the fun thing is that in the Eastern tradition, we still have these. We call them the iconostas, the icon screen, but we still have them. And you can go to any Orthodox church and just see one, right? And there are obviously variations in layout and things like that. But the point of this is that you could look at this, and I think just intuit the entire medieval model. Like if you really just like stood yourself in front of one and just meditated on it and contemplated it for a long time, you would get it. And this is something that Lewis was never able to come around to, mainly because of just his own hang-ups. It has to do with his own religious history.
Well, he's Anglican, right?
He's Anglican, and he sort of varied on, moved towards and away from, like, you could say Anglo-Catholicism, which is like, more traditional, we would say more medieval Anglicanism.
Mm-hmm.
He moves towards it and away from it throughout his life. At one point, he had a Father Walter Adams, who was an Anglo-Catholic priest who was Lewis's confessor. So Lewis went to confession, starting in about 1940. And Father Adams, convinced Lewis of the real presence in the Eucharist. He helped him to begin the discipline of reciting the daily office, which is like the daily cycle of psalms that the church says every day.
Okay.
And the recitation of the Psalter and all these things. And Lewis was really into all of that. And then one day, Father Walter was like, all right, so why don't you try the rosary? And Lewis nearly had a breakdown. So
Why?
there it's just, I mean, you have to like understand the social stigma that's associated with so at Oxford, right, as a student, Tolkien wasn't allowed to sit with the Anglicans. They put all the Jews and Catholics at their own table, because they're sort of like, yeah, Catholics in England. I mean, Tolkien, not long, not too many decades before Tolkien was born, it was still illegal to be Roman Catholic in England, right? So so there was still a lot of stigma and there was a lot of prejudice, and about that during the kind of coinciding and actually predating just a little bit Lewis's life. There was something in England called the Oxford movement, which is this movement within the Anglican Church, within the Church of England, to return to its more medieval roots in some areas. Okay. And that's kind of what Anglo-Catholicism comes from. But so for Lewis, this was just a bridge he couldn't cross. And I think that as a result of that, he's brilliant on so many things in The Discarded Image, but there needs to be another chapter on, for instance, hagiography. Right. Hagiography, the Lives of Saints, is the most popular, it's the most written, the most copied, and the most read form of literature in the Middle Ages, bar none.
Okay.
And it's completely absent from this book. So this is and actually hagiography is wonderful. Like even the really crazy legendary ones are wonderful and very intuitively symbolic in a way that fairy tales are.
Oh, like St. Christopher crossing with the Christ child crossing the river.
Yeah, St. Christopher, St. George, and the dragon. Today's actually the Feast of St. George, as we're doing this today. Okay. So anyway, all that to say, I think that is that's a major gap if we were going to write a sequel or an addendum to The Discarded Image and say, if you really want to get your head into the medieval model, we need to describe what would it look like, what was devotional and liturgical ritual life like in the Middle Ages. And actually Duffy's book does that really well. And then the other thing that we would
it's just a quick read. Yeah, and I can see Duffy's book is just the same, right?
It's a lightning. It's only about 600 pages, so you should get through it in no time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shipping alone on that thing. Anyway.
Yeah. But then the second thing we really want to do is basically a whole chapter, and I've kind of been doing some stuff on the Symbolic World blog, moving this direction, is to say, how did people in the Middle Ages read hagiography?
Okay.
Because I think that would also be super important, and actually, it takes the fun thing about all of this stuff is that it takes the stuff that Lewis is giving us, which can sometimes seem, despite the fact that he's talking about a world held together by love, it can sometimes seem like a little cold, a little academic, the way he's describing it. Not always, but sometimes. It takes it all and it just makes it like warm and fun, and who doesn't want to sit down and hear a story about St. George killing a dragon?
Yeah. Crazy people. That too.
Yeah, crazy people. Yeah. So if we could sort of fill in Lewis's gaps as a medievalist, and I think Lewis is brilliant on many, many things, but if we could fill in his gaps as a medievalist, I would say it'd be these two areas. And I think that maybe there's somebody out there who wants to write a good sequel or chapters. How many chapters in this book?
Like 4 or 5. There's not very many chapters.
Yeah, so chapters. There's 8 chapters. So like 2 chapters, 9 and 10. Something like that. I think that'd be useful. So
yeah. Okay. Well, the next. I mean, you can. I don't know. Someone could write the whatever C.S. Lewis Publishing Society. However, I don't know how that. Whatever it is, whoever's in charge, that you can write like an appendice or something, maybe, or some medievalist somewhere can.
Some medievalist somewhere do that thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So okay, so now we finally made it to the end where we will probably talk for another little bit of time because this is relevant to this is the application part of the homily. No, this really I actually related the most to the epilogue because when he explains about what is this model in a more theoretical context and what our model is and how people make models and find evidence to fit those models, not because they're making it up, but because you see what you wish to see. It's like a relevance realization. It's you pick out, like I found this out, like when I was first found out I was pregnant, all I could see was pregnant women everywhere. So yeah, okay, so we are. Let's start with what you said at the beginning. Our model is falling apart. Why? Do you know why? I mean, you can just answer this for everyone, and then we can move on. So
Yeah.
no, not a hard question.
I don't totally know why. I mean, I know I can point back to all the same people and the same wars and the same books and things like that everyone points to. At the end of the day, though, it's falling apart because we were putting too much stress on it. Any kind of a system that you overtax, right, it's going to fall apart, right? I have a 2003 Honda Pilot. It's an old car, but it's great, right? And it runs, and it's so I keep it, But if I was going to then do a cross country road trip in that car, that might be the end of it, right? Because it's just going to be too much stress all at once for such an old machine. And that's the way it is with the old, let's say, the modern model. It's
or as Paul Van Clay would call it, modernity.
Modernity, yes. I like Paul. He's sort of my exception to like despite the fact that he's a Calvinist, he just seems like a really fun guy.
He will love this.
Like
I hope
really
he watches this.
Guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy his stuff. But anyway,
despite the fact that he's a Calvinist, I love that.
Yeah. Sorry, Calvinist, not sorry.
Hashtag. So okay, so
yeah.
Why have we overtaxed our system? Like, what is it? The internet?
Yeah,
is it?
It's just no, because it started before the internet.
So like World War II.
Well, I would start it at World War One.
Okay.
We could say that the modern model has been very good for. It was good for conquering stuff, right? Mm. So the conquest and the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries far eclipsed anything done in the ancient world, right? You could, I'm trying to decide how crazy I want to sound here for a second. Okay, so
just go. This is the end. Like, there's 5 people watching. Like.
Okay. So in Canada, you guys are on the metric system.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Down here, we still use imperial units.
Mm-hmm.
Feet, yards, etc. Okay. Feet and yards are they're a more. Most of the time you think in yards, like just like most of the time the world is flat, right? Most of the time you think in yards, right? Feet and yards have to do, and even like the old systems of cubits and things like that in Bible times, those things have to do with your tangible experience of the world, right? So the metric system comes along, and I don't think it's a huge coincidence that the main guy who really pioneers the metric system and makes it a standard for all of Europe is Napoleon Bonaparte. Right,
who is the
to me he's the apex of modernity, right? Like Napoleon is basically he tries to do old world things in new world ways, and it could not hold together, right? But he's one of the main people who pushes this, and basically the idea of the metrical system is that it's more scientific because it's like
tens.
Right. Well, so first of all, like we like say, okay, the Earth is this long, and then we're going to divide that into these segments to get 1 meter, and then we're going to do everything off of that meter, either in tens, going down, or tens going up, and those are all of our, So the idea is that this is more, obviously the math is easier to do in your head. No one's arguing that, but basically when that happened, it took a tangible experience, like the experience of our bodies, out of the question of how long is it, right? That's a crazy shift.
Wait, what are yards? Is that like 1 step or something? Is that the tangible part of...
a yard is about a single stride for a full grown man, but it's also like ells and yards are ways of measuring fabric.
Okay.
As it's being woven together, things like that. So all of this stuff is like interconnected, and some of it comes from what are the measurements on my body, right? And some of it comes from what trade do I work and things like this. But the reason there's so much base 12 stuff is that originally Indo-European peoples, especially Germanic-speaking peoples, probably used a base 12 system because a base 12 way is an easier way to count if you have one hand. You're working with your other hand, and you can just count the knuckles on your fingers and get to 12, right? So that's why we have a dozen, a gross, etc. And that's why we still have 12 inches in a yard, or 12 inches in a foot, right? Yeah. Okay. So all that to say, when we went from trying to answer the question, how long is it or how far is it, based on my experience of the world, and to instead say how we're gonna answer that with a question of just like this arbitrary distance that everyone's agreed on and has been enforced by a top-down authority, right? Those are two different experiences of the world, and I think that when that, like, to me, it is no coincidence that coincides with the greatest experience of warfare and conquest in human history. And so because the idea of trying to measure something, and this is even in like biblical symbolism, the idea of trying to measure something is to place boundaries on it, is to define what it is, right? And so to measure something is in one way to like take control over it, right?
To lord over it. Okay.
Yeah, to lord, right? The ruler, right? That word means two things, but it really means the one thing, right? So just to like get totally crazy for a moment, I think that's not a coincidence that our capacity to basically have universal weights and measures, right, coincides with this period of conquest and warfare, which culminates in the Second World War and the rise of nationalism and all these other things. Because what we what modernity is good for, what the modern model is good for, is measuring and setting boundaries and setting limits and saying, but it's not a relational way of knowing your limits and sort of saying, I'm born into the world in this way, so this is where I belong. But it's like man is now going to be the measure of all things,
well,
right?
It's top down.
We're going to say you go here, right? The whole idea of like a planned society, which is obviously catastrophically failed multiple times in the 20th century. But the whole idea of a planned society is to say, if we got a committee together, we could plan this better than basically nature and tradition has taught us.
Oh yeah, committees, right? They're the answer. Yeah, they always do it best.
Yeah, right. They just. So all that to say, I think we got to the end of that. Like, I think we just got to the end. In some ways, it's the nuclear revolution which broke this, right? Because we were going out as far as we could, and we're going down as far as we can, and then we split the atom, and things start coming apart. Like the idea of the atom in ancient philosophy is that it's the smallest possible particle. You can't go smaller than an atom, right? It's like the fundamental like block of matter. So when you split that, and then your world starts falling apart around you, like, what did you think was going to happen? Right. And so in some ways, the things that have accompanied that, nuclear warfare, having that capacity, right, all these things like that opened us into a new age. So now as people go deeper into the quantum realm, what they're finding is, if you go far enough into quantum physics, the world becomes narrative again. It's the only way it exists, right? And so we conquered everything. We got to the end of everything. We got to the edge of everything. Colonialism, all the evils that came out of that, is part of that story, right? And so we hit the end of everything. And now that we've hit the end of everything, the model just couldn't support the weight we were putting on it, right? And so as it begins to collapse, the question then becomes, well, is the world actually knowable, right? Is God actually knowable? Like, and trying to answer that question.
Period, like a question mark.
Right. Yeah. So as we hit the wall and just like exceed the stress that can be put on this super linear model, right? The question then becomes, well, what's next?
Well, So I'm interested to hear what you think about this, because as I was finishing up The Discarded Image and thinking about our model compared to the medieval model, it's actually, even though it's very dissimilar, but there are some similarities in the everything ordered, in the scientific materialistic worldview. Sorry, I know you don't like that word, and I can't remember what you used as a replacement. But you insert that here. What was it again?
Social imaginary.
Social imaginary, but that's too lovely for this. So we'll just say worldview for them.
Fine,
they get worldview. Scientism,
okay, all right,
if you will.
They can have it.
Yeah. So that very, like, what is objective? Like, what are the facts? They have it very ordered, extremely ordered and knowable, you could say, you know? But the difference is, and I know that there's many differences, but the medieval social imaginary, they had room for the unknowable in they had their margins. And it seems like the scientific model doesn't actually have room for the margins, to me. Like, they might say, oh, there might be unknown things. They use the scientific method to hypothesize ideas, but like you said, we're coming to the end of the unknown things, to the point where we're almost circling back, and that's why a friend of mine calls it flatland. That's why it seems like flatland, because they don't have a room for a margin for things that might be supernatural, for things that might be whatever. So I'm wondering what you think about that idea.
As far as what I think is coming next.
Well, as far as, is it similar in the sense of, like, we like things ordered in the scientific space, but then everyone not
properly
likes
things
done, because it's just
everything likes things ordered. Okay, so let me give you two different pictures of order, right?
Okay.
Let's say that I cut a branch off of a tree, okay, and I set that branch down on the table. Is that branch ordered? Like, are the leaves ordered on that branch?
I mean, yes, they're in the place that they grew into.
They're in their proper place, and nature is like fairly, like, on its own, usually pretty beautiful, right? Like, if you don't monkey with it. So if I take a branch and cut it off a tree, and and I look at that branch, I put it on the table. Of course, the branch is out of place, but for my illustration, it has to be on a table. Okay. So I look at that branch, and I can see every leaf on this branch is in its proper place, right? So we could say this branch is ordered. Now, if I strip every leaf off of that tree, and I sort those leaves according to size, shape, and color, and then I cut up that branch into twigs, and I sort the twigs according to length and thickness, and I lay all that out on the table. Is that ordered?
It's our modern version of ordered.
Yeah, it's very organized, right? So I've put everything in a place based on a category that I have forced upon it, but it's no longer a branch.
Okay, right? So that's the difference. So that is the, like, we like it ordered the same as the medievals liked it ordered, but our versions of ordered is exceedingly different.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So everyone wants to order things, right? But you can order things, like, in a natural way, and that's what the whole idea of things kindly inclining, right? In other words, things are doing what their nature makes them to do, and they're being drawn together by love, right? That's one way of ordering your world. And if you try to order your life that way, then what you will find is you'll fall into a certain kind of relationship with your husband, a certain kind of relationship with your children, a certain kind of relationship with God and the people around you, and it'll be lovely and it'll be beautiful. It won't be perfect, because you're going to get things wrong, but even when you get things wrong, there's an orderly way to fix them, right? But the other thing you could do is to try to take some outside order that is not in accordance with your nature, as a human being, as a woman, as Andrea. If I was going to, Chesterton has a bunch of great characters in his books, in his fiction, that are good examples of this, right? But let's say that I decide I'm going to live my life totally according to scientific principles, right? And I'm gonna data monitor every aspect of my life, and then I'm going to, so I can find out like what's the optimum temperature for my coffee in the morning, and what's the optimal, food pairings so that I have the right amount of energy and libido and and like I fall asleep at the right time and don't get like and just like order and like hyper measure every one of these things and basically say so an ideal human life is hitting these statistical averages. So I've got to make sure that all my measurements are within those statistical averages, right? Well, it might work for a while, but two things would end up happening. One is that I would end up getting just totally burned out, because you can't give that much attention to every part of your life, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, it's wrong to give that much attention to every part of your life. You really shouldn't give as much attention to your food as you give to your prayer. Mm-hmm. And if you do, then your life is disordered, right? So one is I'm gonna burn out because I'm just giving too much attention to everything, mm-hmm. right? And the other thing that's going to happen is that other people are going to look at me and be like, actually, Richard's not a normal person. Like, you shouldn't live like this, right. because what they're going to see is like because my attention is all going to be in the wrong place, and I'm going to have stopped living according to love, and now I'm living according to trying to hit this hypothetical perfect statistical life, right? Okay, this is like on a micro scale. That's what we're trying to do in our society right now.
But then there's things coming back that, like you kind of alluded to it. So now we're kind of turning back, and margins are pushing into the center in ways that might not be the best. But what do you do when you push them away and try to pretend like they don't exist? And there's all these different versions of things happening outside of the order that our parents and grandparents thought existed in society. So the things are coming back. So are parts of the medieval model coming back, I guess, is really, that's how I'll form it in a question rather than a statement.
Yeah. What I would say is that Christ is always new but never novel. Okay. So Christ has this capacity in his story, in his person, to renew everything, like to constantly make things new, right? He has a way to integrate paganism, right? But he also has a way to integrate the good things about modernism. So as we start to return to a more narrative way of experiencing the world, which is what postmodernism has kind of done, not totally, but definitely moved us in that direction. As we move back towards this more narrative way of experiencing the world, I think, yes, there are going to be things from the medieval model that are coming back. But the good news is, like, you don't have to go read every single author that Lewis mentions in The Discarded Image, although if you do, you probably won't regret it, but you don't have to go read every single one of those authors to figure out what to do with the world, right? Because Christ is going to carry all those things up and sort of bring all those things up into himself. And so as far as like what's next, for society at large, I literally don't know. You've got small kids, I think I do too. It's frankly a scary time to be raising children in a lot of respects, but we can never, ever, ever lose sight of the fact that there's this constant potential for new life and renewal. That's not going to be, again, it's not novel. It's not like we're going to come across a new idea that no one's ever thought of before, and that's going to be the thing that saves us. Not saying that at all. But the reason that you're seeing these parts of the Christian story being resurrected right now is because resurrection is our whole deal, right? That's our whole thing. And so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I mean, I can tell you where to be when it happens, you know, and sort of be there and live in your body and tell good stories, you know. Don't give Hollywood all of the narrative power in your life, right? But really, like, find a way to participate in the story of Christ. And if you do that, then I think that you'll find your way to whatever the answer is. You know, because honestly, and we didn't talk about like how much religion was okay on the channel, so please forgive me if this is too much for your listeners.
No,
but
well,
like,
this is where we're at. This is like, what is the answer to the things, and this is
yeah.
well, I'll say
but
the
honestly,
answer,
it's just
your answer.
It's honestly like Christ loves us too much to leave us where we are, right? Like, he's not going to abandon us to the wasteland that is the aftermath and the wreck of modernity. So like, just Jonathan kept telling Jordan Peterson the other day, right? Attention is the key, right? Attention is the key. What are you giving your attention to right now? Sort that out. And what you'll see then is that your life will take on the medieval model, and it won't be because you read, Macrobius. It'll be because your life begins to be moved and held together by love.
I think that is a very good place to end, and we will have to do a Tolkien episode next time.
For sure. Yes.
Thanks so much for coming on my channel, Richard. I think it's a very good follow-up to the Pajot Vanderklay interview, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. This was so much fun. I talk about Tolkien a lot. I very rarely get asked on to talk about Lewis, so this was a lot of fun.
Well, good. Well, you're welcome then.
If you would subscribe, that would be the bee's knees.